Welcome to the Wild Ag Podcast, where we'll serve as a connection point for landowners and conservation professionals who want to integrate conservation and agriculture. I'm Dr. Andrew Little, Professor of Landscape Ecology and Habitat Management and Extension Specialist at the University of Nebraska.
And I'm Nate Pfluger, Precision Ag Coordinator for Pheasants Forever and an avid outdoorsman with friends and family in my free time. Together, we'll work to bring you perspectives from both landowners and conservation professionals for discussions on soil, water, and wildlife in ag-dominated landscapes.
Welcome back to the Wild Ag Podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Little. I'm here with my co-host, Nathan Pfluger, and we're fortunate to have Dr. Jordan Giese along with us today. He's going to talk a little bit about prairie strips and wildlife and some of his past PhD research. But before we get started, we're going to turn it over to Jordan and let him give a little background about himself, kind of his education and experiences before we jump into the topic.
Yeah, happy to be here, guys. So I'm originally from Fremont, Nebraska, so just about 45 minutes up the road, up 77 from where you guys are sitting. Did a lot of camping and a lot of fishing when I was a kid in Nebraska and South Dakota, which really stoked, I think, my early interest in wildlife and wildlife ecology. Went to the University of Nebraska-Lincoln for my undergrad degree. One of my first research jobs there was working on farms throughout Nebraska, looking at nest success of a few songbirds, which kind of got me into the birding realm and kind of the agroecology side of it. And then after graduation, I worked for about a year managing some CRP contractor properties in Gage County and Johnson County, which really gave me some insights into kind of the land management and landowner perspective of everything. After that, I went to North Texas, a little school called Tarleton State University in Stephenville, Texas. Worked on a game species called white-tipped doves in the lower Rio Grande Valley of southern Texas. Kind of looking at their habitat associations, but the valley is a very agriculturally dominated region, kind of similar to what I came from in eastern Nebraska. And then after my master's, I ended up at Iowa State University working on my PhD up there and got into some of the research we're going to talk about today, specifically with prairie strips and wildlife. And after graduation in 23, I ended up in my current position at Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute, back down in Texas at Texas A&M University, Kingsville, where I work on water birds, both game and non-game. So everything from northern pintails and cackling geese to egrets and herons. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'd love to actually bring you back on and talk about some of that research. I think it sounds like a pretty cool thing. Well, so can you tell us a little bit about prairie strips and kind of, Iowa State kind of getting some of these things kicked off? I know you obviously came in as a PhD student, obviously after a lot of that it got initiated over there a number of years ago. But just to give folks a little bit of a background on what prairie strips are, how did that come to fruition, and one of the things I always hear a lot is how are they different than filter strips? Is a question I commonly get. So, yeah.
Yeah. So really, I think they still think about it like this, but we kind of break up strips into strips phase 1 and strips phase 2. And strips phase 1, the early beginnings were way back in 2007, a group of Iowa State University researchers, Lisa Schulte-Moore, Matt Liebman, Matt Helmers, and some others, really came up with the idea of establishing these catchment scale experimental trials of prairie strips at Neal Smith National Wildlife Refuge near Des Moines, Iowa. And they sowed prairie plant species in strips along contours and foot slope areas within corn and soybean fields, kind of different treatments. The treatments were selected to test whether prairie strips could deliver, increases in benefits disproportionate to the area that they occupy. This is based on a hypothesis called the disproportionate benefits hypothesis. And these treatments consisted of fields that were in 0% prairie, so 100% crops, 10% prairie or 20% prairie. I believe they were all planted with the same seed mix, about 32 forb and grass species. And they found that replacing just about 10% of a crop field drastically increased biodiversity and ecosystem services with minimal impacts on crop production. And I think some of those specific results were things like 37% reduction in surface water runoff, 95% reduction in sediment loss, 77% reduction in phosphorus phosphorus runoff, and I think about 70% reduction in nitrogen runoff. As far as ecosystem services goes, pretty beneficial. And then as far as wildlife and biodiversity goes, they had about 2.5 times more insect species in those 10% prairie strip fields, 3.5 times higher pollinator abundance, and about 2 times more bird species and 2 times higher bird abundance. And maybe most importantly, there wasn't really an influence on crop yield beyond the acreage that was removed from crop production, and not really any additional problems with weeds, and they're pretty much the same cost level and a little bit cheaper than installing things like terraces. So there was kind of an economic aspect to it as well. And so that's strips phase 1. Strips phase 2, a lot of these numbers, as they started to come out in publications and communications from the outreach team, really spoke to a lot of private landowners in Iowa that were interested in putting some conservation on their properties. So I think it was 2016, that project expanded to working farms across Iowa. And so all of the research in the last decade that you've seen come out of the project is coming from that expansion to strips phase 2 on private working farms. And then I guess the next big milestone that happened while I was there, that in the 2018 Farm Bill, prairie strips were officially included as an official cost share practice, CP 43, which really cleared the way for a lot of growth and the ability to get prairie strips on the landscape. So I think the last time I looked at it, prairie strips are in 14 states, and about 26,000 acres of prairie strips exist in the project right now. So that's kind of the history. Yeah.
No, that's great. And I bet you for Lisa and Matt and many of the others there you mentioned about earlier, I imagine when they first started, they never imagined it would turn into what it is today.
Yeah.
And we actually here at University of Nebraska, we're partnering with Iowa State right now. We're wrapping it up here in December, a project in collaboration with them, One Prairie Strips. And so we now have prairie strips established at 4 of our major research and extension centers here in the state of Nebraska. Basically, as points of view for the landowners can come see them at field days. We have them planted in kind of an average diversity mixture and then a high diversity mixture. We kind of broke them up in kind of randomized treatments. And the point really from our perspective was to be able to show people on our research and extension centers, here's what these could look like on your land, just to kind of give them some perspective. And I think we'll dive into this a little bit later, but, it takes a few years to get these established. So that time when we first started it here, it was really about finding lands that on our research and extension centers that were visible and that we could take and have these more as longer term trials that we could test out. And to the point now, it's been fun because I've actually had researchers here that are reaching out and saying, hey, I'm interested in pollinator work or I'm interested in soil health work. Could I use those prairie strips that are established? And that's essentially the point of them. So, no, that's awesome. Glad to hear that.
So you mentioned that there were kind of 2 phases. Phase 1 was the implementation on public lands, and then phase 2, which was really, quite a bit later, 2016, when you started seeing it on private lands. Were there big changes in order for landowners to implement practices on private lands, or was it pretty similar to what was implemented on public lands?
Yeah, the first few years, it really was, it took a lot of voluntary effort from landowners to get them. Essentially, there wasn't really a cost share mechanism for them to be able to establish prairie strips. So a lot of it was them putting their own money into the establishment and management of them. And I think, really, that Farm Bill hurdle that they were able to clear in 2018 allowed for a lot of the more entry level folks, or maybe people that had been watching from the outside for a while and kind of just vaguely interested, to be able to kind of get more involved in the project and get feedback from the Prairie Strips team, because all of a sudden it was going to be a lot more economically available to them. So yeah, I think a lot of our landowners from, the early years, there are prairie strips that are, were planted in 2013 and 14, but it really wasn't until 2016 where we started to actively monitor a lot of the wildlife response and some of the ecosystem services on those private farms.
And so you kind of mentioned economics. Obviously, when it comes to putting these practices on maybe productive or unproductive acres, you're going to see different costs and benefits and savings and things like that. Did you guys do any economic assessments for those early landowners enrolling in the program?
Yeah, so I think some of the economic stuff has been summarized with new data and some of the old data. And we know that, putting acreage into prairie strips definitely does not have an effect on crop yield beyond the acreage is taken out of production. And the actual cost compares pretty favorably to other conservation practices like terraces and filter strips, things that manage nitrogen and sediment. And now that they're CP43 eligible under a 15-year CRP contract, I think farmers can receive like a total reduction of approximately 75 or 80% in addition to that per acre CRP payment. So yeah, so I think a lot of, it's kind of it depends on a lot on context, right? Kind of how valuable those acres are that are being taken out, which county, like in Iowa, CRP per acreage payments like varies widely across counties, and kind of the demand for them. So it does depend, but it seems to be a way more economically feasible thing today than it was, 10, 15 years ago.
That's really interesting. Yeah, and I think that's one of the really important things, Nate, that you're talking about is that economic piece. That's always the go-to. What's the overall impact to my operation? And it's interesting, as you were alluding to there, Jordan, that the outside of taking those acres out of production, it's not having an additional like loss to your income there. Because I know that's one question I've always wondered, and I know some people have asked me, well, if I put more habitat back in, does that attract them more insects, which then in turn may go out and I have to now put more pesticides in the field? And I would argue that based on what we've seen, particularly in the UK and the way they do beetle banks, which is a similar concept, they've actually seen greater benefits by putting those prairie strips out there and actually having beneficial insects go in there and reduce the non-beneficial insects, which in turn actually reduces your pesticide application and subsequently costs that you're having to put on the field.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, there's been some early results that show that soybean yield can be improved by greater pollinator abundance. I think there was a study in 2021 in Iowa that showed that. And so I think a lot of that research in the United States is still kind of young and ongoing. And specifically with prairie strips, I think that's going to be a primary focus is this idea of insect pests, but also pollinators and kind of the relationship along those prairie strip edges specifically.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing to think about, just because you're putting habitat within your field, that doesn't mean you're going to be taking some of your most productive acres. I mean, in some situations it might, right? But maybe you have a spot that's just erodes year after year. So that's kind of where you target that perennial habitat. And then in the end, who knows, you're probably raising your field average, which benefits you long-term anyways, because you're not cropping those poor acres.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, just on back to the economic piece, and something we're working on within our next 5-year plan for our lab is thinking about tools that we can develop for producers that can basically evaluate kind of current status quo versus alternative options. And so whether you're taking marginal acres out that you're not that are not yielding the best, putting them into prairie strips and getting a payment for those, or you're doing that and then having other hunting lease or ecotourism opportunities or things like that, just to see if there are other options out there. Because I think that's part of the big barrier right now is these are nice ideas, but ultimately I want to see somebody doing this, and I want to see how they're actually able to improve their overall farming operation, economics, and what they're driving on their farm from this kind of holistic perspective of management.
Yeah. So. Yeah. And, it depends on everybody's value system.
Sure.
I think some of the testimonials out here from landowners when I first got started, specifically were about soil quality and wildlife. And some specific things with wildlife is like, you'd hear from somebody how much more they're able to hunt their property for pheasants or have friends and family out to hunt prairie strips specifically for pheasants to some pretty good success. So even though it might not be like a direct economic incentive, there's still some value based there, depending on the landowner.
Yeah, I like that. That's really good.
So when it comes to wildlife, what did your specific research project focus on around prairie strips?
Yeah. So I overlapped with another PhD student. We were both kind of looking at different aspects of the wildlife response to prairie strips. So for me, I was looking at kind of population level responses of grassland birds, mostly songbirds, to prairie strip establishment. So my PhD research included about 6 years of bird surveys across 10 commercial farms scattered across Iowa. We were really interested in breeding bird response and primarily whether prairie strips were benefiting grassland birds, which are the most imperiled group of birds. We've lost about 53% of them since 1970. And what we found was, compared to conventional crop fields, overall bird abundance was about 2 times higher in fields with prairie strips. And grassland bird abundance was about 3 times higher in fields with prairie strips. So even a stronger response just among grassland birds. And those include about 17 species. Some of the strongest responders were things like red-winged blackbirds and dick cissels and meadowlarks and common yellowthroats. But one thing to note was, and we didn't expect this, we didn't hypothesize this going is like area sensitive species like northern bobwhite and bobolink and grasshopper sparrows were not really expected and did not end up showing really a strong positive relationship. But even some of those responders that are common, I think people kind of think of red-winged blackbirds as a pest species. All those species, specifically red-winged blackbirds and dick cissels, have also seen pretty steep declines since 1970. You might not think of it, but I think red-winged blackbirds are between 28 and 30% decline since 1970. And then in Iowa, specifically, dick cissels, I believe, are about a 1.5% per year decline. So even these common species, we think of them, maybe they're grassland birds, but they're like edge grassland birds. A lot of them are in pretty steep decline. And so seeing a response from those was good. And of course, bringing in Matt's work, this begs the question, okay, we have this idea, we have this possible concern that we're creating a population sink, which I don't know if we need to get into the technical term today, but essentially, bringing birds to an area that looks great, but they're not necessarily going to reproduce at higher clips, higher rates than they would in other areas. So we had this concern that we're just creating this trap. So Matt's research really looked at, okay, so birds are more abundant in fields with prairie strips, but are they actually nesting there? And are their nests surviving and succeeding at higher rates compared to other possible places on farms to nest? And he did find that I think they had about 1,600 nests across like 6 or 7 years in the data set. And they found that things like red-winged blackbird and dick cissel do nest more frequently in prairie strips than other types of like grassy features like terraces or filter strips or low diversity contour strips. And they experienced higher rates of nest success in prairie strips than those other types of covers. And I think with red-winged blackbirds, they actually experienced higher rates of nest success than have been reported in large intact prairies. So that was kind of a big finding. It was like, okay, maybe we can cool off this ecological trap, this ecological sink question a little bit, because these birds are actually doing a little bit better in prairie strips compared to other things that are available on farms.
Yeah, that's great. Do you recall, was there any sort of a positive or negative effect depending on how big that prairie strip was, maybe width or length or just overall acreage size?
Yeah, so most of the ones that were in my data set were pretty constant, between like 5 and 10 meters wide. Matt had some that were a little bit wider on some of, I think it was the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation properties. And what he found is that prairie strips had a positive effect on nest survival. And, some of that, the ecological sink question I keep referring to goes into nest parasitism. So not really in the Midwest, pretty much everywhere now we have in agricultural areas brown-headed cowbirds, which are a native species, but also a nest parasite. So they lay their eggs in other birds' nests and essentially trick those birds to raise them. There are a lot of birds that will just eject or remove those eggs from their nest. Things like American robins are 100% cowbird egg rejectors, but a lot of our grassland birds aren't really equipped to reject those eggs. And so it was a concern going in that this ecological trap question was actually about brown-headed cowbird parasitism. And I think what Matt found was that having a wider prairie strip reduces those parasitism rates a little bit. And so that was actually a beneficial thing.
That's really interesting. So, you saw a bigger jump in bird response as you got into, 3 to 4, establishment. Can you kind of talk a little bit about that and why you guys think you saw that?
Yeah, we think, that those big jumps were really coinciding with changes in vegetation and vegetation management. I'm sure you guys have talked on the podcast before with folks, you don't just drill prairie seeds into the ground and watch them grow. There's a lot of active management that happens. Sure. in the first 2 to 3 years. And so I think, typical management of prairie strips includes, 2 to 4 to 5 mowings in year one, and then 1 to 2 times per year the next couple years after that. Sometimes there's some prescribed fire involved in those first 3 years. And then by, year 4, maybe 5, prairie strips are typically, finally getting to having greater coverage of those native species that you've planted and greater vegetation cover overall. So I think a lot of specifically the grassland bird response was coinciding with what was happening on the ground with the vegetation.
That makes sense. Yeah, I know at one of our sites, our Eastern Nebraska Research and Extension Center, the first year we had a lot of foxtail. And so, of course, going in there, and actually the manager up there said, hey, can we mow that? And I said, absolutely, let's get that mowed. So, and that obviously was great. And over the past few years, seeing that established. And I think, you made an excellent point there. You really start seeing that jump after just a few years, particularly because you have a lot more diverse species in there, plant species, and it just takes time. And I think that's one of the big things we've talked a lot about in the past in the podcast is conservation is not a microwave type thing or your phone where you can get on Google and get something instantaneous. It takes time. And so, but if you have some time, have a few years, then that's when you start seeing those impacts, but it takes a little bit of time to get that going. So that's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
I appreciate you sharing that.
So when you were working on actual farms with prairie strips and doing your research, did you have producers maybe complaining about how they looked in the first few years?
Yeah, not directly to me. There's definitely some testimonials from producers. I'm thinking of one specifically in Wright County, Iowa, where his neighbors would complain, or not necessarily complain, but ask him, you got a lot of weeds growing in your field. I'm not sure, that's necessarily a good thing. What's going on out there? And his response was, in the spring, my fields get green right away where everybody else around me is still brown. And so he really liked the aesthetic of, kind of that natural, phenomenon of spring green up in prairies compared to, when you plant in April or May and it takes, till June sometimes before some of the crops start sprouting. So, he kind of took that head on. But yeah, I remember specifically some of the landowners getting, maybe not complaints, but questions from confused neighbors.
Yeah, definitely. I just wanted to make sure that you were getting some of that in Iowa because we get it here in Nebraska quite often.
Okay, yeah, most definitely. Yeah, definitely.
We even had it out at our Grant, Nebraska site for one of our prairie strip sites out there where we had some folks calling into the extension office and asking, when are you guys going to spray that out there?
Yeah,
it's like, that's actually part of an experiment. We're putting prairie strips in. So.
Right.
And so we put some signage up because we also have time-lapse cameras on these sites. And this speaks to that kind of 3 to 4 year establishment. What we're actually doing is putting those out with the goal of we're going to essentially establish kind of this, time-lapse video series of kind of, starting from phase 1 planting and then seeing that prairie emerge over time. So.
Yeah. And I think that signage definitely helps. It's just something
absolutely.
that people don't see on the landscape, right? Maybe they see waterways or field margins that, are smooth brome grass, but, they see a long, linear feature of like what looks like weeds to them probably until it flowers in August and September. So I think it's just something people aren't used to seeing. And a lot of our landowners would have signs up. And I think it's specifically for that reason.
Yeah, it's
definitely helps. When it came to your research, what sort of monitoring techniques were you using to catalog nest success or breeding responses?
Yeah, so for my dissertation specifically, we did bird point count surveys. And so we would go out usually starting around dawn to all these different farms we were surveying birds. And we would conduct kind of these standardized surveys where we'd get to a point in a field. We would stand there, allow birds to go back to normal behavior. And then starting at some point, and then for 5 minutes, we would identify every bird that we saw or heard on the landscape. So a big part of that is identifying the species, but also estimating the distance to that species and or to that bird individually. And then through some fancy math, once you get the survey data back, you can pretty much figure out at what rate you're detecting birds. We call it detection probability, and then use that detection probability to correct a count of density or abundance. And so, whether you're detecting a bird at 10 meters or 100 meters or 200 meters makes a little bit of difference in that correction, but it kind of allows you to do it in a statistically responsible way. And so we did that We did 3 point counts. So each farm, depending on the size of the field, would have between 3 and 6 bird point count stations established in them throughout the field. And then we would return 3 times a year. Usually we were trying to get some of the early breeding season in the May, then one in June, and then maybe another one in July. And so we compared prairie strips, fields with prairie strips, to a direct comparison within each property of a 100% conventional crop field. So it's kind of a paired design. That way we could have taken account, these things have similar management, so we wouldn't expect any differences we see based on management or, surrounding land cover or anything like that. And so the paired experimental design allowed us to kind of not worry as much about the other context other than just the experimental design.
That's really interesting. Yeah, kind of similar to our Department of Energy grant where we basically had that paired setup that worked really efficiently. So with, can you, just for listeners out there who may not be familiar with point counts, can you just kind of explain a little bit more about what that actually is and, kind of like maybe almost like walking through, you get to the spot and like, what are you doing?
Yeah, so I would, park the truck probably before dawn every day, and then I would have, my map and my GPS of a grid of points, get to a field, travel to the first point, wait for a couple minutes, and then turn on the stopwatch, get my laser rangefinder, get my binoculars, and conduct a 5-minute bird point count. And so that's 360 degrees. My data sheet literally is a circle of 360 degrees, and I would know where north is, east is, south is, and west is, and that way I could, if a bird moved, I kind of knew which general location it was. And so we're assuming that we're detecting everything close to the bird point count observer, and our ability to detect those birds is decreasing as you move further away. So whether that's 100, 150, 200 meters. So you're writing down the species, you're writing down, if it's a male, usually a singing bird is a male, whether it's an adult, maybe you have juveniles later in the year that you're going to get if they've fledged the nest. Later in July, we might have, big flocks of red-winged blackbirds. So all that can be filtered out eventually. And so you get, kind of a point where you're mostly detecting territorial male birds, and you're kind of using that as an index of the population. So really a bird point count, some people think of it as, a direct count of all birds in the field, but really because of your lack of ability to see everything, and also the higher detection rates of male birds because they're very conspicuous in singing, a bird point count is actually an index. You're assuming that if a male bird is singing, it's probably defending a nest territory, even though you might not detect that female, that it's established in the field. So it was very fun. You'd get to, sometimes I would go out to Pottawatomie County, Iowa, which was 2.5 hours away from Ames where I was based. So I'd be getting up at 3 a.m. to hit the road. And then conduct bird point count surveys for a couple hours, and then head back to Ames. And so we were kind of all over the place, clear out in Buchanan County, which is close to Cedar Rapids, and then sometimes all the way over by Council Bluffs. And so we were all over the state. So it was a lot of driving, but a lot of seeing cool places.
That's really cool.
Did you ever have any thoughts or maybe try to use acoustic recording units so you personally didn't have to be out there doing all those surveys?
Yeah, we had ARUs out, and we ended up using them for a springtime study that went into my dissertation. At that point, we were very interested in the number of birds specifically, and that's getting density or abundance within a field, within a treatment, what have you. So that's at that point, it was a lot harder to do with ARUs, so autonomous or acoustic recording units. Now it's actually getting easier. So, we have those recordings, but at that time, 5, 6, 7 years ago, it was a little bit easier to just get presence of species, right? So you couldn't, tell the difference between individual birds that were singing around an ARU. You could kind of just tell that species was there because you couldn't, do the distance sampling thing like I've been talking about, or really, tell the difference between individuals. And so we had those out. We didn't end up using that for the breeding season because we wanted the human observations where we're able to see exactly how many birds are and how far away they are. But nowadays, if I had to redo the study, I think there's a better way to incorporate those. So there's Andy's familiar with this. There's a software called BirdNet that allows you to automatically detect birds even in long field recordings. And now it's gotten to the point where people understand how sound travels a little bit better. So you can develop like an algorithm to estimate the distance to a sound signature from the ARU just on an audio recording. So I think, as we go along, it's going to be a lot easier for people to estimate things like density and abundance with ARUs, but we weren't necessarily comfortable doing that quite yet. But, that's also some data that we have archived that we could always go back and try to do that later.
That's really cool. Yeah, we've been talking about some projects like that over here, particularly doing more long-term monitoring. I think that's one of the benefits of ARUs, and I've been able to take and put them out and listen, and then, hey, 5 years down the road, I want to go back and pull out data from another suite of species that I didn't look at originally. You have that ability to do it. Well, that's really helpful. I appreciate you sharing that about how to do point counts, because I think that's something that we in the wildlife realm probably take for granted, kind of what we do. But I think it's really important from a science communication side of things just to explain how that actually works and what that actually means to people. So did you have technicians working for you to do that, or was that just kind of you in and of yourself and Matt, or how did that kind of work?
Yeah, there was a graduate student on the project that started the first couple of years of data collection, but it was just her and I that collected all those data. Oh, okay. So yeah, that was my primary gig during the summer, and we had some other projects that bled into the fall and winter eventually. But yeah, that was sometimes six, seven times a week going out and doing a bird point count. And it's based on timing, right? So those birds get there. A lot of them are migratory, so they get there, and you need to start surveying as soon as possible as they establish territories. And then, by middle of July, the corn is 7-8 feet tall. It's not very fun to walk through a cornfield, and you really can't hear birds or see birds once the corn is 7 feet tall. And so you get a little bit of summer at the end of summer that you can kind of relax and sleep into like 7 a.m. So yeah, just a couple of us conducting those surveys, but
that's cool. Time. Well, and the reason I asked you that, because I know that's something over here for some of the bird projects we've had, you have to do a training with your technicians so that they can go out and listen for a whole suite of species, and then, like you were saying, estimating distances, and it's a lot of work and a lot of training going into that.
Yeah, and absolutely. And people that do these large scale bird survey studies, they do account for that. So like if you have several people that are conducting the surveys, there's a way to incorporate that into kind of that density reset, that density correction is what I was trying to say. And so that you're accounting for maybe observer bias. Maybe if you have an undergrad technician that's conducting surveys that's a little bit less experienced than the graduate student or the professor or things like that, there's a way to incorporate that in that correction. And so it's something that even statistically you can think about.
That's cool.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you said that your fellow researcher, Matt, maybe found or had some data that pointed towards songbirds were having greater nest success in the prairie strips compared to large tracts of perennial habitat.
Yeah, I believe it was specifically with red-winged blackbirds. And so, so, he ran into sample size issues too. And so he would go out and look for nests in grassy features on farms. And so, one of the limitations of this, comparing fields with prairie strips versus just crops with the nest stuff specifically, is that there's not a lot of songbirds that are just readily nesting in crop fields, right? So occasionally you get a killdeer or a horned lark or something like that will use crop residue from the previous year and initiate a nest in like April or May, and probably get out of there by the time that crop is getting a foot or 2 foot tall. And so Matt, really his comparisons were among grassy features or other features on the landscape. And so he did a little bit of nest searching on prairie strips and filter strips and terraces and large patch grasslands. And so he was able to draw some of those comparisons. And so, his sample sizes were greatest for species whose nests he could find easy. And so his red-winged blackbird and Dick's sissel, both grassland birds data sets, were a little bit higher. And so he was able to do some, more complex comparisons because he had more nests for those species. But specifically with red-winged blackbirds, he was able to find that, nest survival was actually higher in prairie strips than what he was seeing with conventional or 100% prairie blocks.
Interesting. For your research specifically, did you look at, landscape scale type things? Did you look at prairie strips closer to woodlands or further away to woodlands? Did that have any effect on nest success or breeding response?
Yeah, so we looked at the number. So, it's a lot of this is hypothesis driven. So you kind of try to think of what's going to affect grassland bird abundance. And so, things like woodlots maybe you'd be making a hypothesis based on predation or avoidance behavior or something like that with woodlots, or maybe the complexity of the landscape. If there are more grassy patches on a landscape, when that bird returns from spring during spring migration and it selects a landscape and then it selects a field and then it selects a patch within the field and then it selects a bunch of grass to put their nest in, maybe there's something going on with that. And I don't think we really found anything at the landscape scale. And so a lot of these birds are probably returning to generally the same area and they're responding to local changes. And so, yeah, there's definitely a way to incorporate that. I also think the landscapes around our sites weren't necessarily had a lot of woody vegetation. And I think, maybe we'll get to this later. If you conducted this study in Nebraska, I think that's something that you might be more concerned about. There's a lot more, cedar shelter belts and field margins and areas like that when I think of farms in Nebraska. And so, replicating that study in different states, different regions, I think that could be a concern, is that if you're going to put a prairie strip next to a woodlot, maybe on a farmstead, there might be some avoidance behavior of grassland birds, but I'm not sure we were able to necessarily capture that in our study.
And then what about maybe other perennial habitat in the area, not necessarily woodlots, but larger CRP patches? Did you see any differences?
Yeah, so we didn't necessarily have a lot of that around our sites. These were some very agriculturally intense properties. And so some of them would have block style CRP enrolled. Maybe it was enrolled before they were able to get the prairie strips enrolled. And so we looked at the number of kind of high diversity grassland patches on the landscape. That is something that we looked at. And we found some things that like I think one of them was, red-winged blackbird abundance was higher in areas that were devoid of patches of grassland, which we weren't necessarily able to explain. And so because it wasn't necessarily a hypothesis, it's not something that we kind of looked into. But, in every study, some of those relationships will shake out that you might not necessarily be able to explain, and maybe somebody will kick it around later in the future. But yeah, we did look at, number of grassland patches on the landscape to see what that would do, not necessarily anything that made sense. But I think that's a point of emphasis for future studies, is like, should we target areas where there is a devoid, where there is no grassland? Would that make sense for prairie strips on the landscape scale? Or should we put them in areas that already have grassland when you start to think about connectivity with wildlife populations and things like that? And I think that's kind of an area of research that will be explored as we kind of move through time.
Yeah, I actually was talking to a PF biologist about a year ago, and we had discussed it was not Nate. It was actually somebody different. But we were talking about, using prairie strips as a tool to kind of connect patches, as you were talking about, like these larger intact patches of perennial vegetation. And could they be used as that? And I think absolutely they could do that as a way to help build connectivity. Because as you know, Jordan, similar to Nebraska and Iowa, very similar in the fragmentation issue of patches. And that's, becoming more and more fragmented. And so how do we build connectivity so wildlife can move amongst all these patches consistently?
Yeah. And specifically for terrestrial wildlife, you think about pheasants, they're going to respond to this type of thing a lot more than a songbird that's more mobile and, returns from South America or Mexico every single year and goes through a new selection process and can, fly from one farm to another. With ringneck pheasants, I think the connectivity issue, that could be a really great model species to study some of those things.
Yeah. No, that's really good. So did you get to work a little bit with pheasants then and prairie strips? And can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so some of this is still in progress. So I did have a side project on pheasants during my time at Iowa State. So in 2019, I kind of got to thinking, a lot of this research is not necessarily species level yet, right? We're doing the initial wildlife response to prairie strips. It would be awesome to get some species level research going. And Nate, you can probably talk to this. A great connection point with landowners is our pheasants. Pheasants provide a really good point of contact, right? Like, a lot of our landowners were third, fourth, fifth generation farmers. They grew up on that farmstead or near that farmstead. They used to see a lot of pheasants when they were kids, and a lot of them, kind of lament the status of pheasants nowadays. And so it provides a really good point of contact for really communicating with landowners. And we had a lot of landowners provide those anecdotes about how they used to see a lot more pheasants. And so, some of these ideas get kicked around for a while. And then I think in 2019, we decided to start up a pilot project where we targeted pheasants on farms with prairie strips, captured them and put GPS necklaces on them, GPS trackers on them, and tracked their movements during the winter. And so it started out as a pilot project in 2019 and 2020, and then in 2021 we kind of had our last season. And some of these results are that we've drawn so far are pretty preliminary. This project got kicked out of my dissertation eventually, just due to time constraints, but it's something that we're revisiting right now, and we'll hopefully have a publication together here in the next year. But what we found, and based on movements from January 21st, I think was our first day, to like April 15th, which was our last day of monitoring, pheasants were roosting quite a bit in prairie and grass cover. I think just looking at roosting spots, about 76% of the roosting time was spent in prairie strips specifically, or just grassy cover. And then less than 20, I think it was 18% was in woody cover. And about 5 or 6% was roosting in brush piles and other heavy covers that weren't woodlots. And one of the interesting things we found was that when snow, or I guess we're still finding it, we're still investigating it. What we suspect is that when snow is absent, pheasants are roosting almost exclusively in those lighter grassy covers, including prairie strips. When snow is present, pheasants have to transition to those heavier woody covers. And so some of the winters that we were doing some tracking, some capturing and tracking during, were pretty extreme in Iowa. And it actually works out pretty well when you're trying to capture a bunch of pheasants, because getting them to walk into a trap is a lot easier when they're starving. So if there's a lot of ice and wind and snow, it's a lot easier to catch pheasants because they see a nice little pile of ear corn in a trap, and they'll walk into a trap a little bit easier. So we were able to capture through some pretty harsh winters. And then once we were monitoring pheasant movements afterwards, they definitely trended towards using heavier covers during extreme weather. So it kind of, we talk about prairie strips, and you're like, okay, prairie strips might be good for pheasants, but it points to the importance of having a diversity of covers on farms. Cedar shelter belts are important for pheasants during harsh times. Things like filter strips, which might have a little bit heavier vegetation. You also might have kind of an elevational protection from wind are important. And then, sites with woodlots, we would have a lot more pheasants in the first place, and I think that was one of the reasons. And so we haven't, summarized all of our results yet. Most of that is based on just kind of some descriptive results of what we're finding with the birds. But there seems to be, certainly a lot of potential for people to study pheasant movements with prairie strips. And a lot of, there's not many papers or studies that have put GPS collars or necklaces on pheasants. And so some of those data are pretty novel. I think we're able to get, 4-hour locations for pheasants where, 20 years ago, that just wasn't possible.
Sure.
Well, and especially just in dominated ag landscapes, looking at pheasant movement. And Andy and I have talked about that ad nauseum and wanting to get something like that kicked off here in Nebraska. Do you recall kind of what the average movement, I guess we'll say home range size of these birds was?
Yeah, so I believe it was about 0.15 square kilometers. And when I did, so that was, during the entire winter, when I was looking at what that actually means, I think it's like the size of 8 Walmarts or something like that. If you stacked them all on top of each other. There was a conversion I did for Memorial Stadium. It's eluding me right now. In Lincoln. But so they, compared to their breeding season movements, they're not moving near as much. They kind of find a good area to roost in with a lot of cover, and they wait out the winter there. And so, I think it was about 0.15 square kilometers for the entire winter. And that's really, what we were seeing just kind of on the ground too. It was kind of, you would target areas. There were farms that I would get to, and I would find like a nice hillside to hang out in the truck with a pair of binoculars and just watch how pheasants move around the landscape. And, very consistent. I could be in the truck on January 15th, or I could be in the truck on March 15th. And those same areas were generally the hot spots for pheasant use, especially coming off roosts right at dusk or before dusk and trying to get a little bit of foraging activity in before they go back to the roost. It was kind of very consistent. So it seems like they kind of find a good spot during the winter, especially post harvest, and they kind of hold up until they start moving more in the spring.
Well, and that makes sense. I guess post harvest, there's not a lot of usable structure out in most of these ag landscapes. Do you recall again what the home range size was then in the spring or the summer?
Yeah, so actually, a lot of our transmitters we didn't get. So birds started moving, first or second week of April, and that's when our transmitters started fading out quite a bit. We did have some transmitter failure and things like that, or pheasants would just move off the property, and even driving around with an omnidirectional antenna on the truck, we weren't able to relocate those sometimes. So yeah, so our results are pretty limited to the winter. So I wouldn't want to speak too much about it, but yeah, I mean, starting first, second week of April, pheasants were moving off the property at pretty high rates. And it was always, it's not always easy to tell whether the transmitter failed or whether the bird just moved, a long ways away. So
that's really interesting. Well, and I think it speaks to the bigger challenge. And we have a paper we just published this year, Pheasants 365, in ecology and evolution, and one of my PhD students. And what she did, it was basically a meta-analysis of all the pheasant literature, really in the central kind of Midwest, Great Plains area, talking about pheasant habitat requirements, seasonal requirements, and that what you just spoke to is exactly that point. Pheasants need a diversity of cover types. It's not just one thing. And one of the things I've heard is, well, if I'm out there, I'm hunting like this time of year in the fall, I see birds in a CRP field, whatever that is, whatever that looks like, that I just need more of that. And that could be the case. But also it could be the case that you need other things, seasonally for those birds. It's not just more of that. And what I'm trying to get at, it's really thinking about those birds from that 365-day perspective and their seasonal needs, whether that be in the wintertime, the nesting, brood rearing time. Those needs are going to be very different. And it's important that we incorporate the biology of the species into our management efforts. So
yeah, and one of the things just anecdotally that I would see is those properties that had connectivity, especially post harvest. So you're harvesting October, maybe end of October, early November. Those birds would pile into certain areas, and then they would move until they found some winter cover. And so our landowners with properties that were on creeks, thinking of a couple specifically in northern and eastern Iowa that had kind of a large buffered creek on their property. I think what pheasants were actually doing was moving in from the surrounding landscape, using that creek kind of corridor to get to his property and then settling. And so we would see a lot of birds move into areas, in mid-November and late November, and then remain there until March or April. So I think really cool. On a landscape scale, I think with connectivity, just getting pheasants onto your property, if that's what you're interested in, if that's one of your objectives as a landowner, having connectivity to surrounding properties could be important too, because you're actually funneling your neighbor's birds onto your property.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point.
Yeah, that's good advice. Steal your neighbor's birds by
I drink your milkshake.
Putting habitat in. Just kind of thinking about not only game birds but songbirds as well, and management 365. I think you mentioned that insect activity within prairie strips was 3 times greater than adjacent row crop acres or whatever other acres you surveyed. Can you speak to that a little more?
Yeah, so I only have the numbers for strips phase 1 on hand right now. So some strips phase 2, although, the benefit to pollinators has been consistent across, the eras of strips monitoring. I think from strips phase 1, it was 3.5 times more abundance in pollinators in prairie strips fields, and then about 3 times higher species richness of insects in general. And so some of those studies led to ones that are a little bit more specific. There was one that just came out this year that looked at monarch butterfly abundance in fields of prairie strips. There's been some beetle specific research in fields with prairie strips, and so some of that is now starting to blossom into more taxa specific studies. But on the whole, I think, although I don't have the number of strips phase 2 on me right now, it's definitely kind of similar, about a 2 to 3 times higher abundance of pollinators.
Yeah, and I think that's really important from the perspective. We've talked a lot about this and referenced our wild turkey project here in Nebraska, but brood rearing cover and how important having a diverse insect community out there is, and particularly that's something we've discussed as potentially a follow up of looking into insect diversity at some of these sites to get a better handle. Is it just a handful of species? What does that look like? Because I suspect the diversity of fields today that we have, or maybe lack thereof, more in the monocultural side of things from row crop, we probably don't have the diversity of insects like we historically would have had, like say in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
So I think it's important that we do get an idea of what that would look like compared to the past and how that potentially impacts the population of birds and particularly the different life stages that they are facing. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I never got around to doing this or pitching this to anybody, but I always wondered, and I might sound like an idiot here, but I always wondered about doing like a nice controlled experiment with prairie strips based on possible benefits of birds depredating things like soybean aphids and corn rootworm and thing like that. If you were able to do some type of bird exclosure experiment where you varied the distances from prairie strips and seeing if there's actually like a ecosystem service that birds provide just with pest insects specifically.
Sure.
I don't know. There might be something like that. I'm not sure how much research has looked at corn rootworm and soybean aphids specifically, but it always kind of struck me as a potential avenue for study as well.
Yeah, that would be a very neat study. And I mean, even your beneficial insects too, right? From those native acres.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's some research going on with that, but
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know all the ins and outs of it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the insect specific stuff is still kind of underway. These animals, birds or insects, are still being exposed to some pesticides. In fields with prairie strips, there's still active management. There might still be neonicotinoid treated seeds in these places, and so although we've returned some of those fields to kind of that perennial vegetation, they're still experiencing some of the same stressors that they would in a normal conventional crop field. And so I think a lot of that, as more resources are poured into monitoring, some of those questions can be asked going forward.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
Andy talks a lot about it within his lab is making the data consumable for the landowner or the general public. After you collected a lot of your data and dug through the results, did you go back to the landowners and kind of talk through what you were seeing on their property? And if so, then what was their response to your efforts?
Yeah, I think a lot of them, see this every day and they suspect it. And, some people are birders, bird watchers. Some of them aren't. Some of them pay attention to certain aspects versus others. I mean, the first tangible thing that they see are, the wildflowers, and it's, bunch grass and wildflowers and how much more they have on their property. And so if you have somebody that's interested in plants or, is some type of naturalist, that might be the thing that they're most interested in. And we do have landowners that are interested in birds. And so maybe, they have a bird feeder at the farmstead and they've always been interested in it. And now they can go out in their prairie strip and identify grassland birds that would never have been close to their farmstead. So they're learning new species. But as far as like communicating specific results, the Prairie Strips Project does produce a landowner report every single year, and it gives specific results across projects for the landowners that have been gracious enough to allow us to do some monitoring on their properties. And so that can be a very broad report, and so landowners can kind of latch on to whatever they're really interested in. And so so we will forward papers and give presentations at landowner events, field days, and things like that people are actually out there really listening to us. But also those landowner reports, I think, are something that Lisa and the team has really done a good job with, is kind of rewarding the farmers that have been with the project from the get-go, allowed people to conduct monitoring on their properties and show them what's happening. And it's kind of been a really successful outreach story, I think. So people that are interested in that, there are, there's properties on there, but they have, some encrypted codes and stuff like that. So those landowner reports are available on the Strips website. And so people can look at those and look at them broke down by property. But I think, for people that are interested in what's going on in what is going on their farm, I think those have been a pretty good success.
That's good.
Was it fairly easy for you to find growers who were interested in partaking in the project?
Yeah, so I think, I wasn't necessarily involved in the selection of the general songbird surveys, the grassland bird surveys, but with the pheasant project, it was really easy. I mean, we were mostly limited just by logistics of having to travel out of Ames, and also you want to try to capture pheasants where there are a lot of pheasants because you're never going to capture even like 10% of them because they're really hesitant to walk into traps and things like that. And so depending on the project, I think it was, a different ask. If you were just doing vegetation surveys, it might be, easier to get access to a property. If you're doing, really high intensity, honeybee research or something like that, it might be a little bit more difficult. So I can't speak to every researcher that's involved in the project, but I know with like the pheasant study, which is one that I had to do, direct outreach and talk to some farmers and ask them, first off, if they'd be interested in hosting a study like that, but also if they have a lot of pheasants on the property during the winter, because that was also one of the things that we needed. So, it depends on what taxa you're studying, but on the whole, I think, farmers with prairie strips are pretty open to this type of study.
Yeah, and I would agree when it comes to game bird research, specifically pheasants and or quail. I mean, every landowner wants to know how their property is being used, and then
sure.
if they're implementing specific practices, are they seeing a benefit? Because when it comes to our full season cover crop practice, some of the landowners that I work with, I mean, they really feel that practice is making a difference for their local game birds. So then you see them wanting to put that practice or implement it across more of their acres, which is pretty neat. So
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. No, I love that idea, just really that co-development of the science to the landowners and really engaging with them. And that's something we've pushed a lot because it's so important. That's where adoption, that's where behavioral change is going to come from, and helping them be most informed about what they can do on their property and what are the tools that they need to be most effective.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And I think, another kind of landowner outreach mechanism that the Prairie Strips Project does well with are the field days. And so the
Sure.
farmer liaison that's at Iowa State University, his name's Tim Youngquist, and he kind of runs these field days, which are usually at a current Prairie Strips farm somewhere in Iowa. And it allows people that might be kind of interested but have a lot of questions to come and see how Prairie Strips look on the ground, ask questions from a farmer that's been through the process, been through, maybe the CP43 contracting process, the process of working with the Prairie Strips team and having research on their farm and all of the possible complications or pitfalls and things like that. And so, I think the Strips team has done a really good job of communicating with landowners, but also just, improving the accessibility as much as possible with events like that.
Yeah, that's really good. One question I was going to ask you earlier. So we're talking obviously about a lot of the positive aspects of prairie strips. Are there any concerns or issues that from landowners that they've seen? Maybe kind of wouldn't necessarily say negative, but things that why they may or may not want to adopt prairie strips in their operation.
Yeah,
Have
I
you
think
heard
that,
any of that?
the most basic one was, how am I going to operate my equipment
Okay.
between these prairie strips and moving around these prairie strips? And, I think that's a legitimate concern. The strips team is, if they're involved in the placement and whatever, team is involved in strategically placing these prairie strips can take those concerns into account. And so, it might not be you're targeting the most erosive part of a field. Maybe you're targeting an erosive part of the field that also the farmer is open to placing prairie strips. And so I think that's probably, it's still probably something that they have to deal with and they have to make adjustments for. And so that was kind of one of the more basic ones is, operating equipment around prairie strips compared to how they've been able to do things in the past. I think the weed suppression, or I guess the weed abundance thing was certainly part of it. There's been a little bit of research on weed pressure around prairie strips, and it hasn't been really shown that, prairie strips are encouraging more weed abundance in the field. So that's one thing that they've been able to kind of answer a little bit. But I think those are kind of the two main ones. Yeah, I'm trying to think of anything else specifically, but yeah, it was mainly about, logistics of operating field equipment, and then, the weed aspect of it. And I think at least one of those has kind of been answered, and the other one, you can work with the team and think about how you move around your farm and operate equipment, and some of that can be taken into an account.
No, that's good. Yeah, and I think that's really important, particularly on the design and implementation. It's not just, hey, just going to go put them right here. It's like there's thought that goes into why that's being done. And I loved your perspective of, the landowner can share their, here's some areas I would think that would work better, and here's why. And can we consider these maybe first before other places on their operation?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we had prairie strips in all shapes and forms. Sometimes, if you're really trying to reduce surface water runoff and soil erosion, planting along the contours of fields where, those most erosive areas where water is traveling downhill is most effective. But if that is a logistical concern, you can, change the placement. We had prairie strips that were very linear, running north-south along creeks and things like that. And so, yes, putting them on contours of field is most effective, but they can definitely take different forms based on the landowner objectives.
That's really good.
Did you end up looking at predation or just predators in general at all throughout the course of your study?
Yeah, so Matt, I think this is an area of research that could benefit from more effort. Matt was able to put up game cameras to look at just kind of what predators are on the landscape and quantify predation pressure a little bit. But we haven't necessarily looked at using like nest cameras or something like that. That's really, kind of the apex of predation pressure on birds. It's like you can document what predators are in the area, maybe how they're moving around the landscape, but until you figure out what predators are depredating specific species of birds, it's really not that strong of a connection that you're tying there. And so, Matt was able to compare predator abundance across fields and treatments, but I'm not sure, think about this on the landscape wise. I mean, we're probably drawing mesopredators, things like coyotes and raccoons and skunks, to fields with prairie strips. But we didn't necessarily see lower nest survival in those areas. So it's possible that they're, opportunistically using those like linear prairie strip features to depredate wildlife, but we don't really necessarily see that in the productivity of birds. But I think it's one of those things that could be, put a lot more effort into and study. And, we haven't really even touched much on like the mammal response to prairie strips. And I think that's one of the avenues that people could look into a little bit more.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I mean, I've kind of heard, I guess we'll call it an argument, where people say, well, I'm going to put this habitat out there and it's just going to attract more raccoons, skunks, possums, and things like that. But I mean, at the flip side, I mean, those are going to be out there anyways. So they're just going into the other limited habitat that's out there. If you're adding more habitat, you're giving those game birds, songbirds more of an opportunity to find different habitats. So
yeah, absolutely. And just thinking about it on the landscape, are you actually putting more coyotes onto a farm by putting in prairie strips? I mean, the landscape specifically in Iowa is just full of linear, edgy features everywhere. And so, you might be adding a little bit of, vertical density to the vegetation, and it's a little bit more heavier cover than normal. But, these animals are moving around the landscape in really wide geographic areas. So I would have, some questions about whether, you're actually drawing a lot of mammals, mesopredators specifically to your farm if you establish prairie strips. But I think that's something that future research should definitely address.
That's good. Yeah, no, that's been a question that has come up, and I've heard, and you, of course, highlighted that earlier about these traps, or ecological traps, we like to term them, are prairie strips ecological traps. And I think essentially, there always is a possibility, but again, back to Nate's point, putting more habitat out there will help. As we continue to get more and more fragmented, especially as you were alluding to, for these species are maybe not as mobile, or ones like, we'll say even with pheasants, they want to obviously move about amongst different patches. Building that connectivity is really critical for them to get from point A to point B. And the more and more fragmented we get, especially in the wintertime when you don't have any crops there, how do they get from that point A to point B? And especially if you're a predator, now you have fewer places to search. You can just target those areas really easily versus, hey, I have a lot of habitat and a diverse arrangements out here. It makes it harder. There's more areas to search, to look, to find potential prey items. So, so again, there's an interesting concept to kind of think through.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, we would witness, pheasant predation and things like that, just being out on the landscape, everything from, coyotes to Cooper's hawks. So, I mean, you're drawing birds into that area, but on the whole, I would hypothesize that they're experience higher survival just because they have that cover to retreat to. And even though there's predators on the landscape, there's going to be predators on the landscape anywhere. And so anyway, just thinking about it, like, from a pheasant's perspective, they might pile into an area, and then maybe a proportion of them are going to be depredated anyway. But if a higher proportion of them are able to survive to the next breeding season, then you're probably having a pretty good impact on local abundance and local populations.
That's good.
So, as with any good research project, when you get all the data synthesized and you put your papers out, there's always more questions that come up or more things that we need to research. What are some of those key future projects that you'd like to kick off? Yeah,
just like as a wildlife biologist, I just think there's so many species and groups of species that could benefit from prairie strips that haven't really been studied yet. I mean, pheasants for one. Maybe we'll kind of publish a simple paper with some descriptive space use and selection questions, but I think pheasants and maybe even wild turkey are some that come to mind, and how they're using prairie strips and, landscape context. Are they piling into areas if the landscape has a lot of patches of grassland, or are they still using prairie strips in really simple landscapes? Are they able to get to prairie strips during the winter and kind of that phase of the year? I mean, if there's no other grassy cover on the landscape, then they might be limited. So, from the wildlife perspective, that's kind of where I go. I think the continuation of the studies on pollinators is really important. Like I mentioned, with the pesticide exposure and neonicotinoid treated seeds and stuff like that, do prairie strips actually buffer some of those effects if they're still encountering those stressors on the landscape, or is it kind of just the same as they would if there weren't prairie strips? And, and as the practice kind of expands into new states and landscapes, I think it's going to be important to reevaluate a lot of this stuff based on, seed mixes. What are native seeds in Minnesota versus what are native seeds in Kansas and Oklahoma, and kind of landscape context, like with Nebraska. I think of Nebraska and Iowa a little bit more differently now that I've experienced both of them. If you have more woody cover in an area, what's happening with prairie strips and wildlife? And so a lot of those questions about landscape context and what prairie strips look like across states, now that it's a federally accepted practice, some of these questions need to be reevaluated in different regions. And so, I guess that's kind of where my mind goes with that.
And then I don't think we covered it, but I always like to touch on it. Where did the funding for your specific research project come from, and just who are kind of all of the entities involved in getting that going?
Yeah, so the wildlife response stuff was specifically funded by USDA FSA. And so we also got a little bit of money from Iowa Safari Club for the pheasants project, but most of it was USDA funded, kind of in concert with a lot of the prairie strips research that was going on there at the time. And so, those two bodies were kind of major funding sources, and that FSA grant specifically was kind of a longer term one that allowed Matt and I to kind of do what we needed to do during our time there.
So as we kind of get ready to wrap up here shortly, do you have any other kind of parting thoughts you want to share? Anything that, you just feel like that you really like thinking about kind of the future for prairie strips? I know you were talking about some of these projects. Is there anything else that you kind of think would be helpful for landowners and conservation professionals who are many of our listeners out there that would be interested to learn about? And we'll put some resources up too for prairie strips as well.
Yeah, definitely. I encourage folks to check out the Strips webpage for sure, the prairiestrips.org, or you can just Google prairie strips. There's even a Wikipedia page I saw, which did not exist like 5 years ago. And they can find, specific insights on a lot of this stuff like soil erosion and water quality and insects, things that I'm not qualified to talk about intelligently, and hear from some of the experts on the project, which have been there from the get-go. And then there's some really cool testimonials testimonials from landowners that have been involved from the get-go, interviews with long-term prairie strips farmers. And of course, you can reach out to a member of the team, if you're interested in attending a field day or getting more information, if you have specific questions and around implementing or potentially implementing prairie strips. And so there's a lot of good resources on that prairiestrips.org. So I would encourage people to check out that website if they're interested.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll make sure it's available for them. Whenever you get that pheasant project published with the GPS units, I think I'd like to have you back on to learn a little more about that. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I can talk to you about all the hardships and issues we had with trying to capture pheasants too.
Yeah, well, that would be helpful, as we think about future projects and how to do some of that. I think was there some work over there that Dr. Adam Janke did in regard doing some of that capture as well? Was he part of any of that?
Adam Janke was on my committee, and he kind of would go through the psychiatry or the psychiatry sessions with me after we had failed to capture pheasants for like 3 months and stuff like that. And I think we finally landed on like the fourth method that we tried, and we finally were able to catch some. So it was definitely a lot of, driving on icy 2-lane highways with, -20 wind chill and sitting in the truck and just kind of like getting used to pheasant behavior. And it was a lot of effort. And I think we caught like 38 birds. So it's like, it's not like the sample size that you see with a lot of movement studies, but it was a lot of hard work. And I'd really like to get that published and analyzed here in the next year and hopefully be able to provide some insights to folks.
Absolutely.
Definitely. Yeah. Please share that with us when it comes out. But yeah, other than that, I don't have any questions. Do you have any closing thoughts?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I'm sure, many of your listeners kind of have a connection to some of these things in Prairie. But yeah, I mean, I think, I think about Prairie now differently that I live in South Texas. I live in a very different area. And, every time I'm back in Nebraska, I always try to, go out to 9 Mile Prairie west of Lincoln or some area where I can kind of experience it again and maybe see wildflowers in peak bloom. Because I think, Prairie, what's the Willa Cather quote? It's like anybody can love mountains, but it takes a soul to love the prairie. And I think it's, it's really easy to find that connection to land through prairies, whether you're, a farmer or a kid from, Omaha or Lincoln or Des Moines or something like that. I think it's a great connection point. So I'd encourage people to enjoy their local prairies.
Absolutely. That's great.
Great way to wrap it up.
Yeah, thanks again, Jordan. Really appreciate it, and looking forward to getting this episode released.
Absolutely. Thanks again, Jordan, and thanks again, everybody, for tuning in.
Are you enjoying the Wild Ag Podcast? You or your organization can sponsor upcoming episodes that bring important information to listeners just like you. To learn more, visit our website, go.unl.edu/wildag.
Wild Ag is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave us a review so others can find us and tune in.
And we want to hear from you. You can submit questions or topic suggestions to us at wildagpodcast@gmail.com. That's WILDAG podcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.